Now, as I mentioned before, Mr. Burling and the inspector are foils to one another. Foil is a literary device. It is a technique, and it means that two characters are essentially like polar opposites, and they're designed to sort of clash against each other. Kind of like protagonist and antagonist, except it's not just that, protagonist and antagonist can clash, but possibly be quite similar. Foils are opposites. And of course, Mr. Burling is capitalism and individualism, the inspector is socialism, collectivism, and their dramatic monologues also completely differ. So the inspector's dramatic monologue happens right before he leaves, at the end of his investigation. So structurally, since Mr. Burling's monologue, the play has moved on a great deal. And the difference with the inspector's monologue, and again, I'm not going to do language analysis right now because I've already done that in my video about the inspector, but in terms of analyzing the dramatic monologue as a device, it really fits with the purpose of the inspector as a dramatic device. He is here to teach us a lesson. That's his existence in the play. He is here to make the audience and the Burlings realize the mistakes of the past, realize the importance for change, and make us want to go and be the change we want to see in the world. And so this dramatic monologue coming at the end of his investigation essentially serves as a really powerful summary of all the key ideas that he wants to get across. So he manages to get across his point about the fact that this is not over. This has essentially what he does. How I was saying that the family are a microcosm? The inspector, aka Priestley, is reminding us this isn't a microcosm. This is real life. This is huge. This isn't just the Burlings and Ava. This is the entire working class and their experience, who are like 80% of Britain. It reminds us about the ramifications for all of this, the real world consequences for the real people out there, and the fact that there are many of them. It also talks about essentially the importance of community, of social responsibility, because he points out how interdependent we are on one another. The fact that the happiness, the suffering of each other relies on the others as well. That idea of we need to be socially responsible. We do not live alone. We need to look out for one another. We need to support one another. And he also then has, again, some dramatic irony, except this time the dramatic irony is correct. So the dramatic irony is that if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught in fire and, that's supposed to be blood, and anguish. Oh, sorry, so many typos in this little extract. That's supposed to be will, and that's supposed to be blood. This is obviously dramatic irony for World War I. So it's got all the different kinds of destruction that war causes. You've got the fire representing like the destruction of homes and buildings. You've got the blood with the destruction of people, with how they were harmed and the violence. And you've got the anguish, the mental destruction, the damage to mental health as well. And that's literally the last thing he finishes on, is like, they will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. And so it ends on such a powerful final image that is designed to really stick with our audience. But the key thing, again, coming back to the structure of the play, is that this is not where the play ends. You see, if the inspector represents not just all the other things I've talked about of socialism and collectivism and all that kind of stuff, he also symbolizes legal responsibility because he's a police inspector. He is the legal consequence for doing something illegal. But he also, over the course of his investigation, comes to represent moral responsibility as well. He does not, like, the inspector's investigation is never like, oh, you broke such and such act of 1862. He doesn't care about that. He cares about this person needed support, you weren't there for them. That's what his interrogation really focuses on, is the moral responsibility that we have for each other, the social responsibility that we have for each other. Nevertheless, for the Burling family, the only reason they allow his interrogation to go ahead, the only reason he has any power and status in that family, is because of his legal position as an inspector. So when he leaves, you get an opportunity to see how the Burlings will behave once that legal responsibility is sort of taken back a bit. Once they're alone, do they change still, or do they go back? Even worse, once we find out he's not even real, he's not even an inspector, how do they behave? So structurally, it's so brilliant, because if the play had just ended there, yes, Priestley would have gotten his message across, but not all of his message. Because his message isn't just that we need to change. His message is, here are the blockades to us changing. And the blockades to us changing are those stubborn, older generation capitalists and individualists who will not learn. The Burlings, the Mr. and Mrs. Burling, the Gerald, who do not experience anagnorisis, compared to the Sheila and Eric, who do change, who do learn. So structurally, the inspector's exit, that is another dramatic device. Entrances and exits, who's on stage, who's not. That is another dramatic device you're going to be able to analyze. Not just this dramatic monologue and how much it contrasts with Mr. Burling's and their different points in the play, but also the fact that after this he leaves, and why he leaves, and how essential it is that we see how the Burlings behave after he leaves. And again, check out my video on the ending of the play if you want more detail on analysing the way that they behave when he leaves. Another great dramatic device, like I was just talking about, is the entrance and exits of different characters. So as well as the exit of the inspector that I've just talked about, there are a couple of others that I think are worthy of mentioning. And I'm literally just going to make a list of the different ones and explain why I think they're important. So the entrance of the inspector is so important. I'm running through the chronology of the play, by the way, so I'm going to go through them sort of the order that they happen. The entrance of the inspector is so important because of the way that it happens. It happens in a stage direction where we're told about a doorbell ringing and it interrupts Mr. Burling. The doorbell interrupting Mr. Burling is again a pretty unsubtle symbol of what the inspector is going to do in this play. That lighting gets brighter and harder. The doorbell interrupts Mr. Burling when he's in the middle of talking about how a man has to look after himself and his family and... So the entrance of the inspector and the way that it happens with that doorbell interrupting Mr. Burling is essentially a giant metaphor for the role he's going to play, how he is going to conflict and clash with Mr. Burling as the play keeps going. There's actually another one before this that I've just thought of that actually isn't an entrance or an exit, but it's the way the play begins in medias res. So in medias res is fancy Latin that just means in the middle of action, right? So the play begins where they're already all on stage. They're all at dinner. It's in the middle of things. They don't enter, it's in the middle. And that beginning the play, so this comes before this, that beginning the play in medias res is actually, when you think about it, so important in creating that feeling of this being the fourth wall reality of Britain. It's like, yeah, this was in the middle of all happening. This is just day-to-day life. This is ordinary life, and you just happen to be popping in to have a little look at it. So that in medias res beginning is really important, as is followed by the entrance of the inspector. Some more really important entrances and exits that I'm not going to look at in detail for all of them, but because there's just way too many and this video would go on too long. But keep paying attention to the interrogation order. Okay, so keep paying attention to who leaves, who stays for the different sections of the interrogation, because who leaves and who stays during the investigation essentially affects what information the audience has at different points. So when Eric goes, we have all that stuff about Ava becoming pregnant and what Mrs. Burling did to her, and it's when he reappears that we're suddenly like, you are the father. And of course we have that dramatic irony where we as the audience figure out Eric as the father along with Sheila way before Mrs. Burling cottons on. But if Eric had been there, the way that information would have come out would have been incredibly different. If he had been there, he would have been able to interject a lot faster. Similarly, Gerald disappears for a whole host of time, and the bits that he misses are really important because then when they all come back together later, it's almost like they are piecing together information too. They're conducting their own little investigation, trying to figure out who this man is. So it's always worth paying attention to that, just from a general standpoint of it impacts what information the characters get and when. So you can always raise that question of why is Priestley limiting that information to these specific characters or these specific characters? Why did he not want Mr. Burling there during this conversation? Or why does he not want Gerald there during this conversation? Similarly, it impacts the information the audience has. We are piecing together a picture of a person's life, of Ava's life. And so J.B. Priestley can't sort of give it all to us in a giant wave. He reveals it in a steady order. And by and large, that order is chronological, but there are elements of information that only truly come to light at different points because of the different characters that are or are not there. So as I said, this one is one that I'm talking about quite generally because there are way too many different specific examples for me to give, but that's just something I want you to have in your mind whenever you're looking at the play. Who's there? Who's not? Why are those people actually there and those people actually not? There's just one specific example of who's there and who's not that I do want to talk about because it is really important. And again, you've probably figured out where I'm going with this. It's Ava. It's the fact that she is never there. She's already dead. And her being entirely off stage, her never existing as a physical character on stage, is in part an incredibly important symbol of her mistreatment, her powerlessness, the fact that she doesn't have any voice or control over the narrative of her life, and therefore it has to be told via the people with power. Her life is literally told to us by the people in power. The upper class men who slept with her, the middle class men who employed her, the inspector who's collected pieces of information via his interrogation, the women who have rejected her or gotten her fired or whatever. Her life is told via those in power. That is in itself a pretty powerful message about the powerlessness of the working class. So Ava not being a character at all in this play is an incredibly important dramatic device to talk about if you've got a question about this character, or also it could really work for if you've got a question about the working class too. The entrance and exits, or the lack of characters being on stage, is all about controlling information, right? That's what Priestley's doing. It's how he controls what information we get when. So Ava never being on stage, never being able to tell us about her life, is a really essential part of that because it means we only are able to piece together certain parts at certain times from certain people. But another essential part of that is essentially partly character and partly prop, and it is the inspector and his photographs. Those photographs are, when you think about it, so freaking important. Can you imagine how different the play would be if all the characters saw the same photograph? Or if the audience saw the photograph? How much would that change the plot? So much of the plot hinges on not just Priestley, but the inspector controlling the information people have got. And a key way he controls that information is with those photographs. So the inspector as a dramatic device is key in driving the plot of the play, controlling the narrative, controlling what happens when. And yes, a key way that he does that is through his interrogation. But the other key way that he does that is through his photograph. It's his one line of inquiry, one person at a time rule, and it's his photographs. So what you're able to analyze there is just, again, there's way too many like general moments because it's the entire play. So there's way too many examples for me to be talking about right here. But whenever you're studying the play and, you know, there's a moment with a photograph or there's a moment with the inspector's like one line of investigation at a time, pay attention to how the narrative is being controlled. With the photograph in particular, of course, it's a key way that Priestley is able to cast doubt on the identity of Ava. Is she one person? Is she multiple people? You know, did they all actually do something to the same person or not? We don't know. We can't know because nobody saw the same photographs. Because that's the key thing. If the audience had seen the photographs, the audience would know. But a part of the way Priestley controls that information is the audience doesn't see the photographs either. We are in some ways we have more information than the characters, like thinking about that dramatic irony. In other ways, we are just as clueless as the characters. We have absolutely no idea because of those photographs and what we can or cannot see, what the inspector does or does not tell us. That's a really essential aspect of the dramatic device as well, thinking of the fact that the play occurs sort of real place, real time. So there is never a change in setting or anything like that. It doesn't shift in time. It's just all a sort of continuous, not just chronological, but one consistent moment moving in time. So we as the audience are very much learning and developing and questioning and criticizing as it goes. We are on the journey with them. Of course, the thing that is different about the Burlings versus our audience in terms of that real-time experience is the worlds that they are living in. The world Mr. Burling is living in 1912 is a very different one from 1945. So you could perhaps argue that our audience is learning, changing, progressing, agreeing with the inspector far faster than the Burlings essentially are. The use of the interrogation and the photographs are essentially two parts to a much bigger dramatic device going on, and that is the fact that the play is a crime thriller. Now, a crime thriller is just a story that sort of centers around the committing of a crime and figuring out who committed that crime. So in this case, there wasn't really a crime per se because Ava committed suicide, so arguably the crime is her against herself. But actually, it's almost like I was saying before about the inspector. He's not really about legal responsibility, he's about social and moral responsibility and who is truly to blame here. That's what the crime thriller genre allows Priestley to do, is not a game of whodunit, but a game of who responsible, who is most to blame for what's happened to Ava. Is it the person who got her fired, the person who fired her, the person who got her pregnant, the person who denied her help when she was pregnant? And that's the sort of process that the interrogation takes for our audience. We are hearing crime after crime after crime of not necessarily illegal crimes, but you could say sort of moral crimes, inconsiderate actions, selfish actions, greedy actions, immoral actions that have all had consequences for somebody else. They've been socially irresponsible, morally irresponsible. And our audience, although they are definitely sort of making their own judgments on who is most to blame, the other thing they care about just as much, and that Priestley gets us to care about, how the Burling family react to the accusations against them. Do they, like I was saying before, do they experience anagnorisis? Do they learn from their mistakes or not? And whether or not they learn from their mistakes, how they react during this interrogation has a huge impact on how the audience views them. Mr. Burling's just complete and utter denial, Mrs. Burling's just complete and utter denial really taints the way the audience views them and makes us see them as heartless, cruel, and thus the ideologies, the ways of thinking that they represent also in that way as well. Gerald is a slightly more complicated one in that at the point that he exits, he appears to, I don't know if you could use the word have changed, but to be reflecting on something. He's learning something perhaps because he needs time to step outside as he's just truly appreciated that she's died. However, when he then comes back, it very quickly becomes apparent he learned nothing. So he's an almost like twist. You think he might have learned, but he hasn't learned. So the crime thriller genre is another just so essential dramatic device to Priestley being able to convey his entire criticism of British society. He needs the crime thriller to essentially make like the audience judge and jury of who is to blame. We can also think of the inspector's dramatic monologue at the end almost as like, the closing speech of a lawyer in a case where he's sort of debating his final thoughts and trying to leave those in the audience's mind before he then leaves. Another genre that the play fits into is the morality play. Now, I'm sure you've been listening carefully up to this point anyway, but this one is especially important to listen to because it seems straightforward and simple, but because of that, students tend to miss the key points and not pay full attention to it. An Inspector Calls is not a morality play. A morality play is a type of play that existed in the medieval era and was all about making characters represent the religious sins in order to teach the audience a religious lesson. That's not what Priestley's doing. This isn't about faith. This isn't about God. This isn't about religion. However, he does use the sort of structure, the concept of the morality play in order to make a non-religious, to make a social point, a moral and social point rather than a religious point. The characters, as well as all the other symbols that we've already talked about, the characters do symbolize different sort of sinful behaviors. But Priestley's point isn't this is sinful and wrong by religious standards per se. His point is this is morally wrong in British society. So, Mr. Burling is greed, Sheila is vanity, Eric is lust, and so on and so forth. And they all represent these different, in particular, they all have elements of different things, So yes, Sheila is vain, but she also behaves in a selfish way. So they can have more than one sort of sinful behavior to them. But the key point is, it's like we're meant to be learning from a range of different immoral behaviors. And all of their behaviors are slightly different. The ways they have been socially irresponsible and immoral are slightly different. And that's important because, again, Priestley's trying to point out the range of different ways that we can harm someone. If we think back to the inspector's dramatic monologue, what we think and say and do, we see the way that Gerald and Eric think about women and how that affects Ava, or the way that Mrs. Burling thinks about unmarried women and how that affects her behavior. We see about the things that characters say to Ava and how that affects things. And we, of course, hear about things that the characters do to Ava and how that affects things too. So we see how a range of different immoral actions can affect somebody. That, I think, is the key takeaway of the morality play, is not the sort of religious element. He's not using that. He's just using, look at the range of moral issues and learn from them. That's the other key part he uses. It's a didactic play. It has a lesson, a moral, a message that it wants its audience to take away with it. So it's definitely a crime thriller, and it also is inspired by, is influenced by the morality plays of the Middle Ages as well. The next genre I want to talk about is the well-made play. And this one, again, it's like An Inspector Calls is and isn't a well-made play. For a lot of the play, Priestley makes us think it is a well-made play. So let me explain what a well-made play is. A well-made play was a type of play that was very popular in the 19th century. So it's a kind of style of play that the audience would be very familiar with. And I'll tell you in a second why that's important. So the basic gist of a well-made play is that they had quite intricate, complex plots that built to sort of great peaks of tension. And of course, An Inspector Calls does that. It is quite intricate with all the different, pieces we get together of Ava's life, and it does build to lots of mini climaxes, as well as, of course, ending on a cliffhanger climax too. Well-made plays are also typically focused on events before the play began, and that is true for the entire of An Inspector Calls. They are always talking about things that aren't happening in the moment necessarily of that dining room, but that they have done to Ava in the past. So it seems to fit into, for the majority of the play, a well-made play. But then when it comes to the ending, it's not a well-made play anymore. Well-made plays are supposed to resolve everything. All the different strands, all the different problems are supposed to be brought together and sorted by the play's end. Priestley ends it on a cliffhanger. He doesn't resolve things. So he keeps it a well-made play for like 95% of the play, and then in that last 5%, he breaks convention. He subverts the genre and doesn't follow one of the genre's key rules. Now that is really important. So let's think about why. When we think about him, first of all, following the rules, it's part of that creating of the realistic Britain in an almost meta way. It's like realistic Britain is not just the kind of characters you see on the stage, but it's the kind of play you think you're going to come and see. This is a play like every other play. And it's only in the ending that he's like, no, things are not like that at all. And in terms of why he disrupts it, there's a couple of reasons. One, yes, is audience reaction. It absolutely would stun our audience when it just ends like that. But why would he want to stun them? Why would he want to leave it on a cliffhanger like that? Again, see my video for the details, but the gist is that it's essential to his key message. His key message is things can't just go on as they have before. Things have to change. And if you don't change, something will force you to change. In the case of the Burlings, they didn't change, and so this whole repetition of everything and Inspector coming over to interrogate them is going to force them to. I also think though, we never actually see if they do. We never see if there are any repercussions either. And all of that I think is on purpose, because part of Priestley's argument is that yes, Britain between 1912 and 1945 has made some great progress. Things have gotten better in a lot of ways. NHS, which hasn't technically been created yet, but you know, is on the way. We're becoming more collectivist. Women have more equality. The Fabian Society is really growing, etc., etc. But things still have a really long way to go. Things are not good enough. And so when he breaks the well-made play convention, when he disrupts that, it's his way of being like, we're not done. The story isn't over. Just like the Inspector was saying, there's still millions and millions of John Smiths and Ada Smiths out there. This isn't over. There is no neat and tidy ending to this yet. Those capitalists are still out there. The types of Mr. Burlings are still out there. Will they face repercussions for their actions? Now it's over to you, dear audience, to decide. So I think ending in that way, disrupting that well-made play, is about almost shocking our audience into being like, it's over, the play, but it's not over, life. If you think about it, like if everything had been really nice and resolved, if the play ended with, I don't know, this wouldn't happen anyway, but you know, the Burlings going to prison, or you know, there's a great parade for Ava, or the working class get more rights, whatever, the audience might get to leave with that sort of warm and fuzzy feeling of, oh, everything's turned out all right in the end. But they don't get to have that feeling. They get to have that feeling of, do the upper and middle classes actually ever face repercussions for their actions? And what is next for the working class? And that question is essentially left unanswered because Priestley wants it unanswered, because Priestley wants the audience to answer it. We as the audience need to now go and be that change. And the disruption of the well-made play is a really important way that he gets that across. So when you write your essay about An Inspector Calls, don't just think about that really close-up picture of the meanings of individual words and individual techniques inside of a line. Get the bigger picture as well. Think about the whole play structure, well-made play, crime thriller. Think about the structural significance across the play of the different entrances and the exits. And that is how you are going to get yourself a grade 9 when you write about An Inspector Calls.